What's up, everybody, and welcome to a training camp edition of the Falcons Final Whistle podcast. I'm Scott Bair. Tori McElhaney is across from me via fancy technology. We are not doing this on video. I know that everyone is so used to us doing it in the Ticketmaster studios, but as you all know, there are joint practices going on in Miami, so we are down south where it feels like we're walking on the surface of the sun to watch the Falcons and the Dolphins have joint practices. One other note, we normally have a player. Frank Darby was supposed to go on, not Frank's fault, my fault, because technology, I didn't have it set up for a player. We will get back to Frank next week, we promise. All that preamble over. Tori, Arthur Smith doesn't like to complain about the heat, but my goodness, it was absolutely an inferno down in Miami. But I think the Falcons ultimately got some good work done.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was so freaking hot. I just felt like at one point I ran into a couple of the trainers and everything, and they're like, sweating yet? And I was like, I'm a glazed donut, so don't worry about me. Honestly, it was the hottest practices I've ever been to in my life. And I remember two-a-days with my dad, like in the middle of August. Like, this is not like it's heat for me, like being from the north or something like that. I'm from Georgia. I know what heat is. I know what humidity is, but this was on a different level. But yes, you're right. There was a lot of good work to be put in. I thought especially for me, it was a lot of fun watching this defense work over the last couple of days, getting to see them more live than I think we've seen them up to this point. I thought in specific situations, this defense really came alive, whether it was in the secondary or in the front seven. I mean, I think back to the first day of camp or the first day of joint practices where they were working on some red zone stuff. And it felt like every level of the defense, Troy Andersen has a pick, Zach Harrison gets a hand on the ball. I mean, it felt like the defensive line as a whole was getting a really, really good push into Tua Tagovailoa. There was just a lot that I thought, looking back, when they were in situations like red zone or in end of game situations like on Wednesday when Jaylinn Hawkins has a pick and D. Alford gets a hand on a ball. I mean, they were just stepping up in, I think, the moments that like situationally really, really matter. And I think that was a lot of fun to see this defense work in that regard.
Yeah, I think it was a tweet from Cam Wolfe, who works for NFL Network, and he was talking to Dolphins head coach Mike McDaniel and asked about the joint practices, and Mike McDaniel, in his typical quirky yet funny way, said, if the goal is to be average, then I was super pumped.
I'm sure Arthur Smith would say something similar.
Yeah, the reason why I bring that up is I think part of the reason why Miami looked average was that the Falcons looked pretty good. They didn't win every rep. They didn't win every sequence. For example, and I think that you would agree, if we're going to go with the defense first, right? Mm-hmm. Because you specifically watched not specifically, but you mostly watched the defense on Tuesday, switched to the offense on Wednesday, and you and I flip-flopped, so we could always have an eye on somebody. So we're not here to say that the Falcons dominated, because they probably didn't. But on Tuesday, you saw the defensive line, David Onyemata, Zach Harrison, and Arnold Ebiketie, and of course Grady, really shine, I thought. Mm-hmm. The defensive backs, I watched a ton of secondary play today, and we saw a lot of random dudes like Lucas Dennis made plays. Jaylinn Hawkins was all over the field.
Micah Abernathy.
Exactly. That we saw some of these depth pieces kind of just get their hands on the ball. And we saw defensive linemen really making good and smart moves against Miami's offensive line. And the big question heading into joint practices is, you're seeing a new system. You're not facing the same guy whose tendencies that you know well. You don't really know necessarily what's coming. And I thought overall, the Falcons showed well for this setting. It's not live football. They're not tackling to the ground. There were a couple scuffles. I'm sure we'll get to that, but I thought it was professionally run.
Yeah.
Overall.
Yeah.
And if we go back to 2 years ago, the Dolphins and the Falcons had joint practices. I thought it was pretty one-sided outside of a couple Kyle Pitts plays. This I thought was pretty even, maybe even advantage Atlanta over the course of the 2 days.
Yeah, and I think, something that, we were talking to Arthur Smith and Desmond Ridder after practice on Wednesday, and they were talking about, ways that this offense can improve and kind of what they've learned about this offense while going up against a defense that isn't their own and doesn't know their cadences and their snap counts and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that it was Desmond Ridder who was talking just about the comfort that he feels within this system. And Arthur Smith paid him quite the compliment where he was like, in terms of decision making, he's been pretty damn good at that. And that's essentially that is a direct quote. So the fact that you're seeing progress, I know we've been talking a lot about defense, but you're seeing progress and moments for this offense kind of coming together with a bunch of new pieces. I mean, you talk about, even though Kyle Pitts and Drake London have been on this team now for 3 years, 2 years, so is Desmond Ridder, and Bijan Robinson's new, and you have CP who's been here for 3. All of these pieces they've played, but they haven't all played together, and they haven't played with Desmond Ridder as the quarterback. And so I think this, as much as anything, was a real learning process for this offense, especially Desmond Ridder, to like feel out his playmakers. And I think for the most part, I agree with Arthur Smith in terms of like Desmond Ridder's decision making, even though of course there are times where it's like, well, why'd he go there? Why'd he do this? But you don't know what he's being asked in those moments. You don't know if he's being asked to go deep. You don't know if he's being asked to give it to this guy. So overall, I was pretty pleased with the offense too. I think it'll be fun to see them actually run the ball a little bit more. I know like that's a part they worked on that quite a bit over the last couple days, is just like their fits and their gaps and all that kind of stuff, but you're not running the ball live. And so it's hard to tell, how dominant the run game could potentially be in this next year.
Yeah. Let's stay on the offensive track for a little bit and go to the number 8 overall pick. Bijan Robinson talked after Wednesday's practice, and I thought gave a pretty fair evaluation of himself, just that he understands that he has a lot to learn. And it's so interesting because for a guy who presents himself, he's so sure of himself. He's sure of his faith, and he's sure of his own faith that he's going to work hard enough to be good at this level. I think it was Kelly Price from Fox who asked, is there confidence to be gleaned? You seem like a really confident guy, but he'd mentioned that, yes, there is confidence to be gleaned from that, because it's about doing it at the next level. And I think he needs to go out and prove it to himself that with all these different reads and checks that he has to make and all these positions that he has to play and all these grand plans that Arthur Smith has for this University of Texas superstar, that can he execute the things that are being asked of him? And I think that that's a really interesting kind of concept. I think it was really good for him to work with the first team offensive line, because those are the guys he's going to have to fit behind. He needs to understand how fast those guys can pull out into open space, exactly how they're going to fit, how they're going to do those things. I think that those learnings really came across in the joint practices, and that's the boring stuff, right? You saw him, though, a couple of times make the type of this guy is special type of plays against the Dolphins.
Yeah, you did. It was the very first 15 minutes of practice on the first day of joint practices on Tuesday. And Bijan Robinson does his little jukey move around this linebacker for the Dolphins. And it was just exactly what we've seen him do time and time again for the last couple weeks. And it's seeing him do it against somebody else and an opponent, that was really a lot of fun too, because you're he's not just doing this against anybody, he's doing this against everybody. And I think that's what's so fun about kind of looking ahead and looking forward to this season and what Arthur Smith can kind of cook up for a guy like Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, and he's a major, I think he's going to be a major cog in this offense. Kyle Pitts was a guy who they're still kind of ramping back up into full activity. He didn't see a ton. You watch more offense than I did. It didn't look to me like he saw a ton of team reps today. But maybe just talk about that process. I hate that question. Talk about something. But what are your impressions of Kyle Pitts and how they're kind of gradually getting him ready for week 1? We still have a number of weeks left to go.
Right, yeah. And after practice, Arthur Smith was asked, how much of this first team are you actually planning on playing over the preseason? And he said, he was like, we're planning on playing our guys. how much or how little is still to be determined. I think I said this on our last podcast, like I don't necessarily care to see Kyle Pitts all that much, especially considering that they're still ramping him up. I think we were able to see a bit more of him on Tuesday than we were on Wednesday. But even then, he's out there and he's working on 7-on-7s and team drills and everything. It just may not be to the level I think maybe that we're used to seeing, like what it was when he was a rookie. But that's because he's still working his way back to 100%. You know, I think when you're coming off an injury like that, we have months and months of rehab, a surgery, and especially for a knee. I mean, there's no need, I think, again, to push him into something that he's not ready for. And maybe he is ready and maybe it's just protecting him. But I think overall, I'm not worried about Kyle Pitts getting to where he needs to be because him and Des are working. Him and Desmond Ridder are working together. He's catching a lot of passes from Desmond. I don't necessarily think that just if we don't see Kyle in the preseason, that it's going to be a huge deal. And I think you even asked Bijan Robinson on Wednesday, like how much he would want to play in the preseason. And he kind of said like, well, I mean, if they want to put me out there, they put me out there, but you know, I'm going to be ready whether or not. It doesn't matter if I go out there or not. And I think that's kind of where Kyle Pitts is too. Like if you were to ask him, like, do you want preseason reps? He's like, if they want to give me reps, of course I want to go out there, but it's not the end of the world. And it's not like I'm not going to be ready to go week 1 if I don't have those.
Yeah. Now it doesn't seem like we'll be ready to go week 1 is Jeff Okudah because he suffered an ankle injury last week. It's relatively good news. Just as a minor aside, if you haven't checked your Twitter feed or Tori's camp report, Clark Phillips is going to be A-OK after getting transported off against the Dolphins. But back to Jeff. In talking to Jerry Gray, like you did on Tuesday, and talking to Trey Flowers, who's been doing a lot of first-team reps, Mike Hughes involved there as well, that in the last 2 years, you lose kind of an obvious starting cornerback, it's trouble. I don't think it's as much trouble this year as it has been in years past. Why is that?
Yeah, it's because of the depth that they've acquired in the secondary. I mean, I think from top to bottom, and even on the day that Jeff Okudah was taken off the field and you kind of are sitting there, you're thinking that it may be worst case scenario. Your mind just goes there because it was kind of not a fun play to watch. You know, you don't like watching somebody get hurt like that, especially with an ankle. And, you know, especially in the preseason, but then you get the positive news that, you know, he could be back in the early weeks of the season. That's according to Arthur Smith. And so, but that also means that you may see 1, 2, 3 games without Jeff Okudah opposite AJ Terrell. But it's not, again, to your point, because of the depth that they've accrued with Trey Flowers, with Mike Hughes, with even D. Alford, Clark Phillips, when he can come back, because he was, you know, day to day, but he's going to be moving back in, I assume, relatively soon because his injury was not super serious. All of these options are playing fairly well. And I know I talked to Trey Flowers after Tuesday's practice, and he's like, you know, of course that you hate it for Jeff Okudah. No one wants to see that. I don't want to see that. But you try and step in where you can, and you prep every single day like you are the starter. And what's really interesting that what I got from Jerry Gray talking to us, and this was something that I put in my camp notes for Tuesday, was he was talking about the homework that he's given Jeff Okudah, that now as he's rehabbing an injury, he's like, all right, now go and watch Indianapolis film from last year so that you can understand how Carolina's offense is going to operate with their new head coach. Go watch that. Don't sit there and just not do anything, because I need you absolutely ready to go when you get the green light to come back out here so that you don't miss the beat. I thought I enjoy talking to Jerry Gray because he can be pretty like straightforward about, okay, here's what I have these guys doing. And I always appreciate that.
Yeah. I've mentioned this before when Cornell Armstrong lost a close rep in coverage and he went right to coaching him. Today, they were doing, I believe, a 2-minute drill, or at least red zone. I can't recall. But Darren Hall kind of gave up the pylon and allowed a touchdown that maybe if he could have been more aggressive, and you can be more aggressive in joint practice, if you can put a shoulder pad into somebody, he could have knocked him out at the 1. And that could have been a moment. That's technically 6 points. That could have been a moment where Jerry Gray loses his mind a little bit. But as I get to know him more and more through these interactions, you can see that he didn't pivot that way. He was not thrilled, sure, but he immediately was like, Darren, you got to get him before the goal line, even if you have to get really physical with him. And I think that those little kind of teachable and coachable moments are important. Better to get him out at the 1 foot line and see how the next 3 plays go. And that's the type of coaching that kind of pervades throughout the secondary. And so many of these, it was fun. Today I watched Ryan Nielsen and Dave Huxtable kind of work with the defensive linemen so close. I had to back up a couple times, but the reason why I wanted to get that up close is really to try to hear the technique and the motivation and the passion with which he and Dave Huxtable work. And I think it was really fascinating. Even with a guy like Calais Campbell, who knows everything, Dave and Ryan are coaching these guys on the techniques that make this scheme work. And without them, it doesn't work quite as well. And, kind of knowing when to rush and when not to rush, to watch these coaches up close in the heat, getting ready to go see another team get cranking. I think that was pretty cool. And I think that, again, we're learning, you and I are learning practice by practice, interaction by interaction about some of these new coaches, about some of these new players, and as you look at where, like, I guess we can go just like to the defense as a whole, right? That we saw them make some kind of flash plays, but if you look at this defense from July 26th or 27th to where you are now, like, what have you kind of learned about this group as you kind of have seen them rep after rep after rep?
Yeah, I think the secondary, and especially when they get Jeff Okudah back, is just, it feels night and day from kind of where it was 2 years ago or last year. This front seven feels different. The way that they were collapsing the pocket around Tua was something that, even when, you're not getting a sack or you're not bringing someone down to the ground, just the way that I felt like they were affecting him, even not going 110%, was like, you can just feel these like small differences in the way that they go about their business, where it's like they're affecting the game and the flow of it. And I think that is evident even 2 days through joint practices, even now 3 weeks through training camp. It's something that you hope carries over into the season, that you still feel this way in week 5, week 6, and on and on and on. But so far, that's something that, like, just 5,000 feet up, it's like, looking at this defense, there are certain pockets that feel different than where we've been in the past.
Yeah, and all that's without Calais Campbell to this point. He got back to practice on Tuesday. He's clearly in a ramp-up period, did some individual stuff, and was just kind of engaged from the sideline more often than not. And talking to him, he was really like, look, we're designed to get ready for week 1. And that's what this defense is aiming towards. Everybody's kind of on different schedules. But ultimately those schedules will merge just before the Falcons play Carolina. That's the goal, is to get through this period healthy and communicating well and coordinated as a unit. I think we've seen that. I'm sure that some of you will wonder, why would you do a final whistle being recorded on a Wednesday, posted on a Thursday when there's a Friday game? And the reason why, as we're kind of wrapping this up, is I think it speaks to the importance of these joint practices. Not saying the preseason game isn't important, but I think that and I'm not trying to make bold predictions here, but I feel like we got to see a lot of the first unit guys get some good work. And I think that's why this evaluation is important. They've done joint practices 3 years in a row now. I know that they're always good. I thought it was, again, professionally run. Yeah. Now that you have a chance to kind of take a step back, at least ever so briefly, because we've only been off the practice field for a couple of hours. Did you feel like this team, that you either learned more or this team got better? Kind of, what are your overall impressions of the work they were able to get done in the last 2 days?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I learned quite a bit about this group and what makes them tick and what their strengths are. I feel like that has become a little bit more evident going up against people who you don't know how they're going to react to certain routes or certain blitzes or whatever the case may be. And I'll say this, for me, going kind of just previewing the preseason game that's going to be played on Friday night, that to me is more about the bubble guys. I honestly use those games to evaluate who I think is going to be guys who are going to be on the 53-man roster come cutdown day at the end of August. So think about like the Frank Darbys of the world, the Penny Harts, the John Fitzpatricks. I know I just named off 3 offensive guys, but they're defensive guys too. But it's those types of players and the plays that they can make that I think are what really stand out when you get to preseason games, less so what the Desmond Ridders and the Drake Londons and the Bijan Robinsons and Tyler Algiers and CPs of the world. I care more about who are these fringe guys on the 53-man roster that could really cement themselves as guys to make this team in a few weeks.
Yeah, so we've gone over a lot of the stars on this team, a lot of the first unit guys. Now Tori and I are going to go through the Dolphins preseason game and move forward into the next wave of camp. That's when we're going to hit you with another Falcons final whistle. We can talk more about guys who are going to fill in key depth roles on the back end of this roster, kind of highlight those guys. Again, hopefully get Frank Darby on the pod. That should be a fun one.
Can't wait.
And kind of keep on continuing as we get through this 3-game preseason slate. So Tori, thank you so much for the time. Thank you guys so much for rating, reviewing, subscribing, all the comments that you guys give us, at least the nice ones. We always appreciate those. And thank you guys so much. We will talk to you again really, really soon. See ya.